My name is Elena and I'm 28 years old. If you've ever been humiliated in public by someone who thought they were better than you, only to have the universe prove them spectacularly wrong in the most unexpected way, hit that like button and subscribe right now because what happened to me at that charity gala will restore your faith in cosmic justice. You're going to want to hear every single detail of this. I live in Charleston, South Carolina, where the summer heat wraps around you like a wet blanket and the smell of jasmine and salt water hangs heavy in the air. The historic district where I work is all pastel-colored antebellum houses with wide porches and iron gates, ancient oak trees dripping with Spanish moss, cobblestone streets that turn your ankles if you're not careful in heels. It's beautiful in that postcard kind of way, but it's also a city that remembers old money and old names, where social hierarchies run deep and everyone knows which families belong and which ones are just passing through. I'm definitely in the second category and I've always been acutely aware of it. I moved to Charleston 5 years ago for a job at a small nonprofit that works with underprivileged youth, teaching art and creative writing programs in schools that had their arts funding cut. The pay was terrible, barely $32,000 a year, but the work mattered to me. I grew up poor in a small town in upstate New York, raised by a single mom who cleaned houses and worked overnight shifts at a truck stop diner just to keep us fed. Art was my escape, my salvation, the thing that made me believe I could be more than my circumstances. So when I got the chance to give that gift to other kids who needed it, I took it without hesitation, even though it meant living paycheck to paycheck in a city where the cost of living kept climbing. That's where I met Daniel. He was volunteering at one of our fundraising events 3 years ago, this tall, charming man with sandy hair and an easy smile, wearing a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He came from one of those old Charleston families, the kind with a family crest and an ancestral home on the Battery and a last name that opened doors all over the South. His family owned a commercial real estate development company that had been around for 4 generations. Daniel was being groomed to take over eventually, but he played at being socially conscious, volunteering at nonprofits and talking about wealth inequality while living in a renovated townhouse in the French Quarter that his parents had bought him. I should have seen the red flags, but I was 25 and flattered that someone like him was interested in someone like me. He pursued me with the kind of focused attention that felt intoxicating. He took me to restaurants I couldn't pronounce the names of, where the waiters knew his family and brought complimentary champagne. He introduced me to his world of yacht club parties and gallery openings and exclusive events where everyone seemed to know each other from boarding school or country clubs. I felt like Cinderella, except I was always painfully aware that midnight was coming and I'd turn back into myself, the girl who shopped at Target and had student loan debt and drove a 15-year-old Toyota. The relationship lasted 18 months, and for most of it I felt like I was playing a part in someone else's life. Daniel's friends were polite but distant, always asking what I did in this tone that suggested nonprofit work was a cute hobby rather than a real career. His mother was worse, all tight smiles and backhanded compliments about how refreshing it was that I wasn't materialistic, how admirable that I dedicated myself to helping the less fortunate, as if I wasn't one of them myself. Daniel seemed oblivious to the condescension, or maybe he just didn't care. He liked having a girlfriend who was different from the country club girls he'd grown up with, someone who made him feel progressive and open-minded. The cracks started showing when I needed him and he wasn't there. My mom got sick, pneumonia that landed her in the hospital for a week, and I was terrified and broke and trying to figure out how to pay her medical bills while keeping up with my own rent. Daniel offered to lend me money, which felt humiliating, but when I started talking about the stress and fear I was feeling, he got uncomfortable. He wasn't good with messy emotions, with real problems that couldn't be solved by writing a check. He started pulling away, working longer hours, being less available. 3 weeks after my mom was released from the hospital, he broke up with me over brunch at a waterfront restaurant, explaining that he thought we wanted different things in life, that he needed to focus on his career, that I deserved someone who could match my passion for social causes. The subtext was clear. I wasn't the right fit for his world and he was moving on. It hurt, but honestly I was more relieved than devastated. I'd been exhausted trying to be someone I wasn't, wearing borrowed confidence to events where I never quite belonged. I threw myself back into my work, picked up a weekend job teaching art classes at a community center to help rebuild my savings, and slowly started feeling like myself again. I stopped checking Daniel's social media after the first month, stopped torturing myself with updates about his life moving on without me. Then about 4 months after the breakup, I ran into a mutual acquaintance at a coffee shop downtown, one of the few people from Daniel's circle who'd always been genuinely kind to me. She was uncomfortable, clearly debating whether to tell me something, and finally she just said it. Daniel was dating someone new, a woman named Brittany who came from an even wealthier family than his, old money from Savannah, a girl he'd apparently known since childhood. They'd gotten together barely 2 weeks after he broke up with me, which meant he'd probably been interested in her while we were still together. The acquaintance showed me Brittany's Instagram and I made the mistake of looking. Brittany was everything I wasn't. Effortlessly elegant, sorority polished, perfectly at home in the world Daniel inhabited. Her feed was full of sailing trips and garden parties and photos at exclusive events. Always perfectly styled, always belonging. I told myself I didn't care, but of course I did. I felt replaced, erased, like the entire 18 months with Daniel had been him settling until someone more appropriate came along. I deleted all my social media apps for a while, focused on work, tried to move forward. Then 6 months after the breakup, I received an invitation that stopped me cold. It was for the annual Charleston Heritage Foundation Gala, one of the biggest charity events of the year, a black tie affair that raised money for historic preservation. My nonprofit had been selected as one of the beneficiaries that year, which meant all staff members were invited. The gala was being held at the Gibby's Museum of Art, and attendance was basically mandatory if you wanted to maintain good relationships with the donors who kept our programs funded. I knew Daniel would be there. His family were major donors to the Heritage Foundation, had been for generations. And he'd probably bring Brittany, showing her off to all the people who'd watched him date me and wondered what he was thinking. The thought of seeing them together made my stomach hurt, but I couldn't not go. My boss was counting on me to schmooze with donors, to talk about our programs, to represent the organization well. So I accepted the invitation and immediately started panicking about what to wear. Black tie galas require ball gowns, the kind of formal dresses that cost hundreds or thousands of dollars. I had exactly $347 in my checking account after paying rent and my student loan payment. I couldn't afford anything new, couldn't even afford to rent a designer dress from one of those services without putting it on a credit card I was trying to pay down. So I did what I always did when I needed something I couldn't afford. I went thrift shopping. I spent 3 weekends hitting every second-hand store, consignment shop and vintage boutique in Charleston and the surrounding areas, searching through racks of outdated prom dresses and bridesmaid gowns, hoping to find something that would work. I finally found it at a cramped little thrift store in North Charleston, wedged between a pawn shop and a dollar store. The dress was hanging in the back corner and I almost missed it entirely. It was a deep emerald green floor length, with delicate beading across the bodice and a flowing skirt that moved like water. The style was from the early 90s based on the cut and construction, slightly dated but classically elegant. It had a small stain on the hem and 2 missing beads, but nothing I couldn't fix. The price tag said $45. I bought it immediately, my hands shaking with relief and residual anxiety. I spent the next week altering it to fit properly, carefully removing the stain with techniques I'd learned from my mom, who'd cleaned enough rich people's houses to know every fabric care trick in the book, replacing the missing beads with similar ones I found at a craft store. When I was finished, the dress looked beautiful, genuinely beautiful, even if it didn't have a designer label and had cost less than $50 total. I paired it with simple black heels I already owned and small pearl earrings that had been my grandmother's. Looking at myself in the mirror the night of the gala, I felt pretty, felt like I could walk into that event with my head up. The Gibby's Museum was glowing when I arrived, lights spilling from every window onto Meeting Street, luxury cars lined up for valet parking. The building itself is this gorgeous neoclassical structure that always reminded me of a Greek temple with massive columns and marble stairs. Inside, the galleries had been transformed for the event, with round tables set up in the exhibit spaces, dramatic lighting highlighting the artwork on the walls, a small orchestra playing in the main hall. Everyone was dressed to impress, women in designer gowns and glittering jewelry, men in custom tuxedos. The air smelled like expensive perfume and the elaborate floral arrangements that decorated every surface. I checked in, got my name tag and immediately felt self-conscious. My dress was beautiful, but walking into that room full of obvious wealth made me hyper-aware that it was also obviously thrifted. The style was slightly different from what everyone else was wearing, the beading pattern was dated, the fabric didn't have that crisp newness of something straight from a designer boutique. I kept my chin up though, smiled at people I recognized, made my way to my organization's assigned table. My co-workers were already there, equally uncomfortable in this setting, and we bonded over our shared imposter syndrome, whispering jokes about which fork to use and whether we were supposed to clap after the orchestra finished each piece. I made it through cocktail hour without incident, chatting with a few donors who were genuinely interested in our programs. Then, as we were all moving toward our tables for dinner, I saw him. Daniel, looking exactly as I remembered, standing near the bar with his hand on the small of a woman's back. Brittany. She was stunning in person, wearing a pale pink gown that probably cost more than my monthly salary, her blonde hair styled in an elaborate updo, diamonds at her throat and wrists that caught the light with every movement. They were laughing with a group of people I recognized from Daniel's social circle, everyone holding champagne flutes and looking like they'd stepped out of a town and country spread. I tried to move past without being seen, but Daniel spotted me. I watched his expression change, surprise followed by something that might have been guilt or discomfort. He said my name, and suddenly Brittany's attention was on me too, her blue eyes scanning me from head to toe in that way women do when they're assessing competition. Daniel made awkward introductions and Brittany smiled this perfectly polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said it was nice to meet me, that Daniel had mentioned me, her tone suggesting he'd mentioned me the way you might mention a mild cold you'd recovered from. We made strained small talk for maybe 90 seconds. Brittany asked what I did, and when I explained about the nonprofit, she made a sympathetic noise and said how meaningful that must be, in exactly the same condescending tone Daniel's mother had always used. Then her eyes landed on my dress and I saw it, that flicker of recognition followed by barely suppressed amusement. She tilted her head slightly and said in a voice loud enough that several people in our vicinity could hear, "Oh my God, I love that you're so confident wearing vintage. Is that from a thrift store? That's so brave." The words hung in the air. People nearby stopped their conversations, glancing over. Daniel looked mortified but didn't say anything to defend me. Brittany's friends, two other women in obvious designer gowns, exchanged looks and one of them pressed her lips together like she was trying not to laugh. Brittany continued, reaching out to touch the fabric of my sleeve. "No, seriously, I think it's amazing. I could never pull off something secondhand, but you make it work. Very bohemian chic." My face burned. The humiliation was physical, a hot wave that started in my chest and spread to every extremity. Everyone in our immediate circle was watching now, waiting to see how I'd respond. I could feel my eyes starting to sting with tears I absolutely refused to shed in front of these people. I managed to say something polite and generic, excused myself and walked away as quickly as I could without running, heading toward the restrooms in the back of the museum where I could hide and compose myself. I locked myself in a stall and let myself shake for a minute, pressing my palms against my eyes to keep from crying and ruining my makeup. The door to the bathroom opened and I heard voices, two women gossiping about the usual society drama, and then one of them said Brittany's name. I froze listening. They were talking about the interaction they'd just witnessed, laughing about it. One of them said Brittany could be savage when she wanted to be, that she'd clearly marked her territory. The other one said something about Daniel downgrading before he found Brittany and they both laughed. I waited until they left before I came out of the stall. I looked at myself in the ornate mirror above the sinks, this rococo thing with gold gilding that probably cost more than my car. My makeup was intact but my eyes were bright with unshed tears. My dress, my beautiful green dress that I'd been so proud of, suddenly felt like a costume, like evidence of everything I lacked. I thought about leaving, just slipping out and claiming I felt sick, but I knew I couldn't. My boss was counting on me and walking out would look like Brittany had won, like she'd successfully put me in my place. So I fixed my lipstick, straightened my shoulders and walked back out into the gala. Dinner was being served and I made my way to my table, avoiding looking in the direction where I knew Daniel and Brittany were sitting. I pushed food around my plate and smiled through conversations with the donors seated nearby, playing my part as the grateful nonprofit representative. The whole time I could feel Brittany's words echoing in my head, hear that barely concealed laughter from her friends. After dinner, there were speeches from various foundation board members and representatives from the beneficiary organizations. My executive director gave a moving talk about our programs and the kids we served, and people clapped politely. Then the evening shifted into its social phase, with people mingling between the galleries, the orchestra playing dance music, waiters circulating with desserts and after-dinner drinks. I was standing near a display of contemporary art, holding a glass of wine I wasn't drinking and counting the minutes until I could reasonably leave, when I heard someone say, "Excuse me, but I have to ask about your dress." I turned to find a woman probably in her early 60s standing beside me, elegant in a simple black gown, with silver hair cut in a sharp bob and bright, intelligent eyes behind stylish glasses. She was looking at my dress with genuine interest, her head tilted slightly. Before I could respond, still raw from Brittany's comments, she continued, "That beading pattern and the way the bodice is constructed. I recognize that work. May I ask where you got this?" I felt my face getting hot again, preparing for another round of humiliation. I told her the truth because I was too tired to lie, that I'd found it at a thrift store in North Charleston, that I'd altered it myself to fit properly. I probably sounded defensive, but I met her eyes, daring her to mock me the way Brittany had. Instead, her face lit up with something that looked like delight. She stepped closer, asking if she could examine the dress more carefully, and I nodded, confused. She looked at the beadwork, ran her fingers gently along the seams, checked the interior construction at the neckline, her expression growing more animated with each observation. Finally, she looked up at me with this huge smile and said, "This is mine. This is one of my designs. From my spring 1993 collection. I made maybe 30 of these in various colors, all custom pieces. This is the emerald version, and oh my God, someone took excellent care of it. And your alterations are beautifully done. You have a real eye for maintaining the integrity of the original design while updating the fit." I stared at her, not understanding. She must have seen my confusion because she laughed and extended her hand, introducing herself. Her name was Catherine Whitmore, and she was a fashion designer. Not just any fashion designer, but someone who'd been huge in the late 80s and early 90s, dressing celebrities and southern socialites, known for elegant evening wear with intricate beading and classic silhouettes. She'd semi-retired about 15 years ago but still did custom pieces for select clients and occasionally consulted for major fashion houses. I'd heard her name before, seen it in the fashion history books I'd paged through during my thrift shopping expeditions, trying to identify valuable vintage pieces. And I was wearing one of her original designs, something I'd bought for $45 without realizing its provenance. Catherine was thrilled, talking excitedly about how rare it was to see her older pieces in the wild, how touched she was that someone had cared for it well enough that it looked this good 30 years later. She asked about my alterations and I explained what I'd done, and she praised my technique, my eye for detail. We were deep in conversation about fashion and design when I became aware that we'd attracted attention. People nearby had stopped to listen, recognizing Catherine and clearly intrigued by what she was saying. And then, because the universe has a sense of timing, Brittany appeared at the edge of our small crowd with Daniel in tow, probably drawn by the commotion. Catherine was saying something about how true style wasn't about money but about understanding quality and having the confidence to trust your own eye, and she gestured to my dress as the perfect example. Brittany's face when she realized what was happening was something I'll remember forever. The self-satisfied smirk disappeared, replaced by confusion and then dawning horror as she understood that the thrift store dress she'd mocked was actually a valuable vintage piece by a legendary designer, and that the designer herself was standing here praising it and praising me. Daniel looked uncomfortable, like he wanted to be anywhere else. Catherine, oblivious to the earlier drama, was talking about how she loved seeing young women like me who approached fashion with creativity and resourcefulness rather than just throwing money at expensive labels. Then Catherine did something I didn't expect. She turned to the people gathered around us and raised her voice slightly, telling everyone that she was so impressed by my eye and my skill that she wanted to offer me something. She said she was curating a small exhibition of her archival pieces for Charleston Fashion Week in 2 months, and she'd love to have me involved, maybe doing a talk about vintage fashion and sustainable style, about finding and restoring quality pieces. She said she'd pay me, of course, and it would be excellent exposure if I was interested in doing styling or design consulting work on the side. The offer was stunning, completely unexpected, the kind of opportunity that could open doors I'd never even imagined knocking on. I managed to say yes, trying not to sound as shocked as I felt. Catherine beamed, pulling out her phone to exchange contact information right there. People were congratulating me, asking questions about vintage fashion and where I shopped. Several women wanted to know if I did personal styling, and I found myself handing out my email address, my mind reeling. Through all of this, Brittany stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, her perfect composure cracked. Daniel had his hand on her elbow, clearly trying to steer her away, but she seemed rooted to the spot, watching this woman she'd humiliated less than an hour ago suddenly being celebrated and offered opportunities by Charleston fashion royalty. When our eyes met across the small crowd, I didn't gloat or smile smugly. I just looked at her, let her see that I was unbothered now, that whatever power she'd thought she had over me had evaporated. They left shortly after, Daniel practically dragging Brittany away, and I heard later from that same kind acquaintance that Brittany had been furious, ranting about how embarrassing the whole situation had been, how she couldn't believe she'd mocked a Catherine Whitmore original. Apparently, her mother had several pieces from Catherine's collections and had been horrified when she heard the story, lecturing Brittany about respecting fashion and not judging people by price tags. The social circle that had been so quick to laugh at me was now telling the story differently, making it about Brittany's faux pas rather than my supposed inferiority. I stayed at the gala until the end, floating on a strange combination of adrenaline and vindication and genuine excitement about Catherine's offer. She introduced me to several other people in Charleston's arts and fashion communities, all of whom were interested in my work and my eye for vintage pieces. By the time I left, I had a handful of business cards and several potential consulting opportunities, plus Catherine's promise to be in touch within the week to discuss the Fashion Week collaboration. The next 2 months were a whirlwind. Catherine was true to her word, involving me deeply in her exhibition planning. She paid me a consulting fee that was more than I made in a month at my nonprofit job, and she treated me like a colleague rather than some charity case she was helping. We spent hours going through her archives, pulling pieces for the exhibition, and she taught me things about construction and fabric and design history that I'd never have learned anywhere else. She introduced me to her network, vouched for my eye and my skills, and suddenly I had a side business doing vintage styling and design consulting that brought in almost as much as my full-time job. The Fashion Week event was incredible. Catherine's exhibition was held in a gorgeous gallery space downtown, and my talk about sustainable fashion and vintage treasure hunting was standing room only. I wore another thrift store find, this time a 1960s Halston that I'd scored for $30 and had authenticated by Catherine, who nearly cried when she saw it and told me it should be in a museum. The local press covered the event, and suddenly I was being mentioned in Charleston lifestyle magazines as someone to watch in the sustainable fashion space. My nonprofit work benefited too. The exposure led to new donors who were interested in our arts programs, and several of the women I'd met through Catherine started commissioning me to do styling work, with the understanding that a portion of my fees would go to support our youth programs. I was able to negotiate a raise at work based on the value I was bringing in through these new connections. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't living paycheck to paycheck. I started a small savings account, paid down a chunk of my student loans, bought myself a reliable used car to replace my dying Toyota. Daniel and Brittany got engaged 6 months after the gala, and I heard about it through social media because by then I'd unblocked and stopped caring. The announcement photos showed them at some exclusive resort, Brittany's enormous diamond ring front and center, both of them looking like an advertisement for old money and traditional values. I felt nothing looking at those photos except maybe a little pity for my younger self who'd tried so hard to fit into that world. I'd found my own world now, one where I belonged not because of my last name or my bank account but because of my eye and my skills and my willingness to see value where others saw trash. A year after that gala, Catherine asked me to partner with her on a new venture, a sustainable fashion consultancy that would work with clients to build wardrobes using a mix of vintage pieces, ethical brands and classic investment items. She wanted to challenge the constant consumption cycle that dominated fashion, especially in wealthy communities like Charleston where status was so often performed through designer labels and obvious spending. She thought my background, my understanding of both scarcity and style, made me the perfect partner for this work. I said yes without hesitation. I kept my nonprofit job, scaling back to part-time so I could dedicate more hours to the fashion business. The consultancy took off faster than either of us expected. We attracted clients who were tired of mindless shopping, who wanted their clothing choices to reflect their values, who were ready to break free from the pressure to constantly buy new designer pieces just to keep up appearances. Interestingly, several of these clients were women from Daniel's social circle, including a few who'd been at that gala and witnessed Brittany's comments and my subsequent vindication. They never mentioned that night directly, but I could tell they remembered, could see them watching me with a mix of respect and curiosity. I ran into Brittany one more time about 18 months after the gala. I was meeting a client at a high-end boutique downtown, carrying a garment bag with vintage pieces I was bringing for her to try. Brittany was there shopping with her mother, the two of them going through racks of new arrivals. We made eye contact across the store, and for a moment, I saw her debate whether to acknowledge me. Finally, she came over, her mother trailing behind, and she said hello with careful politeness. There was no mention of the gala, no reference to that humiliating interaction. Instead, Brittany complimented my work, said she'd been following my consultancy on social media and thought what we were doing was interesting. Her mother looked at me with sharp assessment and asked if I was taking new clients. I explained our waitlist was several months long but gave her my card. Brittany's face was carefully neutral, but I could see the effort it took. We exchanged pleasantries and parted ways, and I felt nothing but a mild satisfaction at how completely the tables had turned. My client arrived a few minutes later, and we had a wonderful appointment, finding 3 perfect vintage pieces that made her cry happy tears because she felt beautiful in a way she hadn't in years. Walking back to my car afterward, the Charleston sun warm on my face and the smell of pluff mud drifting from the harbor, I thought about that girl in the thrift store, desperate to find a dress she could afford, terrified of not belonging at an event where she'd inevitably run into her ex and his new girlfriend. I thought about how that $45 dress had changed the trajectory of my life, not because it was a designer piece, though that helped, but because it represented a choice to show up as myself, to trust my own eye and skills even when I knew people would judge me for not having money. The truth is, Brittany's cruelty was a gift, even though it didn't feel like one in the moment. Her need to put me down, to mark her territory and make sure everyone knew she was superior, created the contrast that made Catherine's recognition so powerful. If Brittany had just ignored me, if she'd been politely indifferent, I might have had a pleasant conversation with Catherine about fashion and gone home with nothing more than a nice memory. Instead, Brittany's public mockery set the stage for public vindication, and the story spread through Charleston's social circles like wildfire. The girl in the thrift store dress being celebrated by the legendary designer, while the girl in the expensive gown revealed herself as cruel and shallow. I'm 31 now, and the sustainable fashion consultancy Catherine and I built together is thriving. We've expanded beyond Charleston, taking on clients across the South and even a few from further afield who come to us through referrals. I love the work, love helping people discover that true style isn't about how much you spend but about understanding quality, knowing what works for your body and your life, having the confidence to make unconventional choices. I love hunting through estate sales and vintage shops, finding treasures that someone else discarded, seeing their potential and bringing them back to life. I still work part-time with the nonprofit because that work still matters to me, because I remember being a kid who needed someone to show me that creativity and beauty were possible even in scarcity. I make enough now that I can live comfortably, can help my mom with her bills, can save for the future. I bought a small house in an up-and-coming neighborhood, nothing fancy but mine, and I filled it with vintage furniture and art from local makers and plants that I managed to keep mostly alive. It's a life I built myself on my own terms without compromise or pretending to be someone I'm not. Daniel and Brittany got married in an elaborate ceremony that was featured in Charleston Wedding magazine. I heard about it from clients who'd been invited, who described the over-the-top floral arrangements and the reception at a historic plantation and the designer wedding dress that probably cost more than my car. They seemed happy in the photos that circulated on social media, or at least they seemed to be performing happiness convincingly. I felt no jealousy, no wistfulness for the life I might have had if I'd been the right kind of girl for Daniel's world. I'd found something better. A life that was actually mine, work that fulfilled me, a community that valued me for who I truly was. Sometimes when I'm digging through racks at a thrift store or estate sale, I think about that green dress, about the chain of coincidences and choices that led me to find it and wear it and have Catherine Whitmore recognize her own work. I think about how easily I could have given up on attending that gala, could have let fear of seeing Daniel and Brittany keep me home. I think about how Brittany's cruelty could have broken me, sent me home crying, confirmed my worst fears about not belonging. Instead, it led to a moment that changed everything, that opened doors I hadn't known existed, that connected me with a mentor who saw value in me that I'd barely started to see in myself. The dress itself hangs in my closet now, carefully preserved. Catherine asked if she could include it in a traveling exhibition she's curating about the life cycle of fashion and the beauty of vintage clothing being worn and loved across decades. I said yes, of course. It deserves to be seen to tell its story. Designed in 1993, sold to some wealthy client whose name we never learned, eventually donated or discarded and ending up in a thrift store, found by a broke nonprofit worker who saw its beauty, worn to a gala where it survived mockery to be recognized by its creator, and now serving as an example of sustainable style and the enduring value of quality craftsmanship. It's just a dress, but it's also proof that worth isn't determined by price tags, that beauty and value exist independent of what others think, and that sometimes the universe has a perfect sense of timing when it comes to proving the right people wrong. So yes, my ex's girlfriend laughed when she saw my thrift store dress, tried to humiliate me in front of Charleston society, made sure everyone knew I couldn't afford what she considered appropriate attire. And then the designer walked in and hugged me, celebrated my eye and my skills, offered me opportunities that changed my career and my life, and inadvertently revealed Brittany's cruelty and shallow values to the same social circle she tried to impress. The irony is almost too perfect, the kind of poetic justice you'd reject as unrealistic if you read it in a novel. But it happened, every bit of it, and I'm grateful for all of it, even the painful parts, because they led me here to a life I love and work that matters and the knowledge that I can trust myself, my eye, my instincts, regardless of what anyone else thinks. If you made it all the way through this story, thank you for being here with me through every moment. Stories like this remind us that the people who try to make us feel small often reveal more about themselves than about us. And I'd love if you'd leave a like on this video if that message resonated with you. If you want to let me know you were here until the very end, drop a comment saying, "This message was for me," because I really do love knowing these stories connect with people who need to hear them. There are so many more stories about finding your worth and proving doubters wrong waiting to be told. So if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that button. There's another story coming up next that I think is going to hit just as hard, so I'll see you there.